This video contains a book's worth of information, so if you'd like to skip to any part, the times will be on screen and in the description below. Free will is perhaps the single most intuitive belief human beings possess. It doesn't feel like a theory, it feels like an undeniable fact of experience. Right now, as you're watching this video, it seems obvious that you could stop watching if you wanted to. You could pause the video, click on something else, or close the tab altogether. It feels as though multiple futures genuinely exist before you, and that you, somehow, are the thing deciding which future becomes reality. This intuition is so powerful that most people rarely stop to question it. In fact, many people consider free will to be one of those ideas that are simply true because it has to be. After all, if we don't freely choose our actions, what could possibly be choosing them? For centuries, this has been the dominant assumption, not only in philosophy, but in law, politics, economics, and religion. Our criminal justice system assumes that people deserve punishment because they freely choose to commit crimes. Meritocracy assumes successful people deserve their success because they choose to work harder. Religion has often taught that individuals deserve heaven or hell because they freely accepted or rejected God. Even everyday language reflects this assumption. We call people lazy, disciplined, irresponsible, virtuous, evil, selfish, generous, as though each person simply authored the kind of person they became. Almost every institution in society is built upon the assumption that human beings are genuinely free moral agents. But philosophy has a habit of questioning our strongest intuitions. The earth feels flat, it isn't. The sun appears to move around the earth, it doesn't. Solid objects feel completely solid, despite being almost entirely empty space. The history of science is, in many ways, a history of discovering that reality is often stranger than our intuitions suggest. So perhaps we should be willing to question this intuition too. Because what if the feeling of choosing is not evidence that choices are free? What if it is simply the conscious experience of a process that was already unfolding according to causes entirely outside our awareness? That is the central claim of determinism. Determinism is often misunderstood. People hear the word and imagine fate, destiny, or some mystical force controlling the universe. That isn't what philosophers usually mean. Determinism is actually a very simple idea. It is simply the claim that every event has a cause, and every cause has another cause stretching backwards indefinitely. Nothing appears from nowhere. Nothing can happen without explanation. Every event is the consequence of previous events. The important question is whether human choices are somehow an exception. Most defenders of free will believe they are. Most determinists think that would be an extraordinary claim. Think about everything else in the universe. When a tree falls, we don't imagine it simply chose to fall. We look for causes. Perhaps the roots rotted. Perhaps the strong winds weakened the trunk. Perhaps the years of fungal decay finally reached a tipping point. Every explanation points to something that came before. When someone becomes ill, we don't see the illness simply appeared without explanation. We search for viruses, genetics, environmental toxins, lifestyle, diets, or chance mutations. Again, we look for causes. If a football smashes through a window, nobody asks whether the football freely decided to change direction. We instinctively search for what kicked it. Cause and effect is one of the deepest assumptions underlying all scientific inquiry. Yet when we reach human behavior, something curious happens. Many people suddenly stop asking what caused the action and instead ask whether the person chose it. This video argues that these are not separate questions. To ask why somebody acted is precisely to ask what caused them to act. And if there were no causes at all, if a decision simply emerged from nowhere, that wouldn't rescue free will at all. It would simply make a behavior random. Throughout this essay, I'm going to argue that every serious attempt to rescue free will eventually runs into exactly the same problem. Our choices come from somewhere. We're going to examine neuroscience, psychology, genetics, sociology, and theology. We'll look at famous experiments showing how unconscious processes shape our behavior long before we're aware of making decisions. We'll examine philosophical arguments that suggest we cannot even choose our own desires. We'll look at why many of history's greatest Christian thinkers defended something very close to determinism. And finally, I'll argue that accepting determinism doesn't destroy morality, it transforms it, because this is something people often misunderstand. Rejecting free will is not the same thing as rejecting morality. It is not the same thing as saying murder becomes acceptable, or that prisoners disappear overnight, or that people should simply do whatever they like because nothing matters. Those conclusions simply do not follow. In fact, I think almost the opposite is true. I think determinism provides one of the most compassionate frameworks through which to understand human beings. It encourages us to ask not who's to blame, but what caused this and how can we change it. It encourages rehabilitation over revenge, understanding over condemnation, compassion over hatred. Ironically, I think abandoning belief in free will makes us better people. But before we get to those conclusions, we first need to answer a much more fundamental question. If free will really is an illusion, why does it feel so real? And perhaps more importantly, what evidence do we actually have that it exists at all? Part 2. Why science has slowly dismantled free will. In part 1, we established the basic philosophical problem for free will. Every event appears to have causes. If human decisions are events, and they clearly are, then it seems strange to suggest that they alone exist outside the chain of cause and effect. However, someone could respond, perhaps human choices do have causes. Perhaps my brain, my upbringing, and my environment influence me, but ultimately there is still a conscious person inside who makes the final decision. This is probably the strongest defense of free will. It doesn't deny that biology matters. It doesn't deny that my childhood matters. It simply argues that somewhere within all these influences, there is still a genuine self who chooses. The problem is, when we actually study human behavior, that conscious self appears to have far less control than we intuitively believe. Again and again, psychology and neuroscience reveal the same pattern. The causes of our behavior often appear before we become aware of making a decision, the world outside our awareness. One of the biggest assumptions people make about themselves is that they are consciously in control of their actions. We imagine a simple process. First I think, then I decide, then I act. The conscious mind sits at the center, receiving information, weighing options, and finally issuing commands to the body. But neuroscience suggests reality is far messier. The conscious mind may not be the commander of the brain. It may be more like a spokesperson explaining decisions that have already emerged from the unconscious processes. Before getting to the brain itself, we can already see this behavior in everyday thought. Most of what determines our actions happens without conscious thought. You do not consciously decide how much to trust someone based on a mathematical calculation. You do not consciously calculate the exact amount of confidence you should display in a conversation. You do not consciously construct your personality every morning when you wake up. Most of who you are operates automatically, and this raises a serious question. If the majority of processes producing our behavior occur outside awareness, how much control does the conscious self actually possess? One of the clearest examples of unconscious influences affecting supposedly rational decisions comes from a famous study examining parole decisions. Researchers studied Israeli judges who were deciding whether prisoners should receive parole. The assumption behind a justice system is that judges carefully examine evidence and make impartial decisions. Their personal circumstances should not matter. A prisoner should not receive a different outcome because a judge skipped breakfast. Yet that is almost exactly what appeared to happen. The researcher found that judges were significantly more likely to grant parole after a meal. As the hours passed and judges became tired and hungry, favourable decisions became less common. After the judges took a break and ate, favourable decisions rose again. The legal judgment of a human being was influenced by something as simple as hunger.
Finally getting lunch and realizing I gave a guy life in prison without parole because I was hangry.
This does not mean judges were bad people. It does not mean they were consciously biased. The important point is that something outside their awareness was affecting their decisions. The judges believed they were simply evaluating cases, but their biology was participating in the decision. And this pattern appears everywhere. The stinky room and the hidden influence of disgust. Morality feels like one of the most rational parts of human behavior. When we decide whether something is right or wrong, we like to imagine that we are reasoning from principles. But research suggests even moral judgment can be influenced by unconscious physical states. In several studies, psychologists found that feelings of disgust can influence moral evaluations. People exposed to unpleasant smells, dirty environments, or sensations of contamination were more likely to make harsher moral judgments. The environment around us can subtly alter what we consider acceptable. A disgusting smell does not provide a logical argument. It does not change the facts of a moral situation, yet somehow it changes our judgment. That is incredibly important for the free will debate. Because if our deepest moral reactions can be influenced by factors as arbitrary as our physical surroundings, then perhaps our decisions are not as purely rational and self-created as they appear. Hormones, evolution, and the person you inherited. But the influences on behavior go much deeper than temporary conditions like hunger or smell. They extend into our biology itself. Human beings often imagine themselves as separate from their biology. We say things like, that is just my body. My brain might influence me, but I am the person controlling it. Yet neuroscience shows that the brain is not something we possess separately from ourselves. The brain is us. Every thought, desire, fear, and decision emerges from biological processes. Hormones influence behavior in profound ways. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, influences social attachment and trust, but its effects are not simply a universal increase in kindness. Research suggests oxytocin can also increase loyalty towards one's own group, meaning the same biological mechanism that encourages cooperation can also contribute to favoring insiders over outsiders. Evolution has shaped us with tendencies. We're not blank slates choosing our motivations from nowhere. We inherit a brain designed by millions of years of selection, a brain built to survive, a brain shaped by competition, cooperation, reproduction, and social belonging. Even personality traits that feel deeply personal have biological foundations. Some people are naturally more sensation-seeking. Some are more impulsive, some are more anxious, some are more socially confident. These differences are influenced by genetics. The famous example often discussed is the MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene. The popular media has often misunderstood this research. There is no single gene that creates criminals or violent people. However, studies have suggested that certain genetic variants can interact with environmental factors, particularly childhood abuse, increasing the likelihood of aggressive behavior. The important point is not that genes determine everything. The point is, who we become is influenced by factors we never selected. You do not choose your genes. You do not choose your temperament. You do not choose the basic architecture of the brain you choose to make choices. Before you were you. And the causes go even further backwards. Before you experienced the world was already affecting you. Your development in the womb matters. A mother's stress levels during pregnancy can influence fetal development. Nutrition, hormones, and environmental conditions all contribute to the developing brain. The person who eventually becomes you begins as a biological process already shaped by circumstances outside of their control. Before childhood, before memories, before personality, before conscious thought, there were already influences pushing development in certain directions. This is what determinism means. It does not mean people are simple machines. It does not mean every person with a difficult childhood becomes a criminal. It does not mean nobody can change. It means that change itself has causes. The misunderstanding of determinism. This is one of the most important points in the entire argument. People often hear determinism and think, if everything is determined, then nothing matters. But this misunderstands what determinism claims. A determined world is not a world where nothing changes, it is a world where changes have explanations. Imagine someone who grows up in poverty, experiences trauma, but through education and support becomes a successful person. Many people would say, look, they overcame their circumstances, they chose differently. But the determinist asks, what caused that change? Perhaps a teacher encouraged them, perhaps a friend supported them, perhaps they had a naturally high level of persistence, perhaps a particular experience changed their perspective. Those things are not meaningless, they are causes. A person's transformation is not less impressive because it has an explanation. In fact, understanding those explanations is how we help more people transform. Laplace's demon. This brings us back to one of the most famous ideas in the history of determinism. The French mathematician, Pierre-Simon Laplace, imagined a hypothetical intelligence that knew every particle in the universe, every force acting upon those particles, and every law governing their behavior. If such intelligence existed, Laplace argued it could predict the entire future of the universe, every movement, every event, every decision. This idea became known as Laplace's demon. Now, modern physics has complicated this picture. Quantum mechanics suggests that reality may contain genuine randomness, but randomness is not freedom. If your decision is caused by something before you, it is not ultimately free. If your decision happens randomly, it is not something you authored either. The question is not whether the universe is predictable in practice. The question is whether there is some part of you that escapes the chain of causes entirely, and so far, science has not found it. Instead, what science increasingly reveals is a human being shaped by an enormous network of influences. Our biology, our environment, our childhood, our culture, our evolutionary history, our unconscious mind. All of these things create a person who eventually says, I chose this. But perhaps the deeper question is, who chose the chooser? And that question takes us into the next part, because even if we accept our brains and environments influence our decisions, there remains one final escape route for free will. Maybe the problem is not where our desires come from. Maybe freedom simply means acting on the desires we have. Maybe we do not need to choose our wants. Maybe we only need to choose according to them. This is the philosophical defense of free will known as compatibilism, and it is where the debate becomes much more difficult. Part 3. Why almost every philosophical escape fails. So far, the argument for determinism has focused mainly on science. We have seen that human behavior is deeply influenced by factors outside conscious awareness. Our biology, our upbringing, our environment, and even temporary conditions like hunger and stress all shape what we do. However, a defender of free will might respond, all of that may be true, my brain influences me, my past influences me, my environment influences me, but ultimately I am still the person making the decision. This is a much stronger argument. After all, nobody believes free will means making choices completely disconnected from reality. A person choosing what to eat for dinner is obviously influenced by their hunger, their preferences, their memories, and their circumstances. The defender of free will argues that this is not a problem. Freedom does not require being unaffected by causes. Freedom simply means that the action came from you. If I choose to go for a walk because I want exercise, that seems free. If someone physically forces me outside, that seems unfree. The difference, many philosophers argue, is not whether a decision has causes, the difference is whether those causes came from inside me. This is a position known as compatibilism. But before we examine whether compatibilism succeeds, we need to look at a more fundamental problem. What exactly is this inside me that is making the choice? And is it itself something I chose? The conscious mind may not be the author. One of the strongest challenges to the traditional free will comes from neuroscience. Most people imagine decision-making as a conscious process. We think, first I consider my options, then I consciously choose, then my brain tells my body what to do. But experiments suggest this sequence may be backwards. The conscious experience of choosing may actually come after the brain has already begun preparing the action. The most famous research comes from the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet. In the 1980s, Libet conducted experiments where participants were asked to make a simple choice, such as moving their wrist whenever they felt like it. The researcher measured brain activity while participants performed the act. What they discovered was surprising. A pattern of brain activity known as the readiness potential appeared before participants reported consciously deciding to move. In other words, the brain seemed to be preparing the action before the person became aware of choosing it. The conscious decision appeared to arrive late. Now, this experiment has been heavily debated. It does not prove that free will is impossible. The task was extremely simple, and later researchers have questioned how much we can generalize from it. But the importance of Libet's work is not that it destroyed free will overnight. The importance is that it challenged a very intuitive assumption, that consciousness is always the thing initiating our actions. Later studies pushed this even further. Neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes used brain imaging techniques to examine decisions before people became consciously aware of them. In some experiments, researchers were able to predict certain choices several seconds before participants reported making the decision. Again, these studies do not mean scientists can read minds or predict every human action. Human behavior is incredibly complex, but they reveal something important. The conscious self may not be the first cause of behavior. It may be observing processes that have already begun, the interpreter in the brain. Perhaps the most fascinating evidence comes from split brain research. In patients with severe epilepsy, doctors sometimes severed the connection between the brain's two hemispheres to prevent seizures spreading. The result was a unique situation. The two halves of the brain could process information independently.
Patients suffering from otherwise incurable and incapacitating epileptic seizures are often helped if the connection between the two cerebral hemispheres is cut. The two halves of the brain are mirror images of each other, connected by the corpus callosum, a bundle of about 200 million nerve fibers carrying information to and from each side of the brain. When it's severed, the brain's electrical impulses that cause epileptic seizures are blocked from spreading. In a sense, the brain is divided already. The nervous system is wired so that incoming sensory impulses from our vision or our sense of touch are routed to the opposite side of the brain. So what's seen by the right eye or touched by the right hand is routed to the left hemisphere of the brain, while the right hemisphere picks up signals from the left eye and left hand. Normally, this information is then shared by both sides of the brain via the corpus callosum. But when it's cut, all that changes. A further complication of the split brain phenomenon is the fact that each side of the brain is better at some tasks. The right side of the brain is thought to be better at perceptual problems, pattern recognition, and spatial relationships, while the left side seems to be better at language, analysis, and creating explanations. Michael Gazzaniga is conducting research at the Dartmouth Medical School, where he specializes in the psychological study of split brain patients.
What we've learned in looking at these patients is that there needs to be a final common path, a cognitive system that unites and pulls together all the behaviors that come pouring out of us, whether they're actual behaviors or whether they're changes in our moods and what have you. We need a system that allows for integrating this and interpreting it into some kind of continuous story about who we are and what we are and where we're going and where we've been. And studying the neuropsychological patient, the broken brain, as it were, as we say, allows you this insight. It shows you that the brain is organized in terms of many modules, many sub-processes. These separate modules can all create real behaviors. They can create changes in mood. But you certainly don't want a system that has all of these modules running off behaviors with no integration. There's got to be something that pulls all of this together into a theory of who we are and where we are in relationship to the world. And the neuropsychological data from both split brain patients and other focal disease patients suggests that there's something in the left hemisphere that we've called the interpreter that performs this integration, this crucial link for human consciousness. The notion here is that the interpreter turns out to be the essential feature of the human brain that allows for this individual stamp, as it were, on our lives, because it is pulling together our own personal events, our own personal responses to the environment, and giving them an interpretation. And that is going to be the system that's going to be responsible for our unique view and our unique sense of self.
Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga discovered something extraordinary. When one side of the brain caused an action, the other side sometimes had no knowledge of why it happened. Yet when asked to explain the behavior, the brain would create a story. It would confidently provide a reason. It would confabulate. The brain was not lying. It genuinely believed the explanation, but the explanation was created after the fact. Gazzaniga called this system the interpreter. The brain is constantly creating a coherent narrative about ourselves. It explains our actions, it explains our beliefs, it explains who we are, but sometimes that explanation is not the true cause. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the feeling of being the author of our actions is not evidence that we are the author. Perhaps it is the brain's explanation for actions produced by deeper processes. We do not choose what we want. But even if we ignore neuroscience entirely, there is an older philosophical problem, a problem that has existed for centuries. It concerns something incredibly simple, our desires. Think about something you genuinely want. Maybe you want a certain career, maybe you want a relationship, maybe you want a particular type of food. Now ask yourself, did you choose to want that? Did you choose to pursue it? Did you choose to desire it itself? This is a much stranger question. Imagine standing outside in freezing weather. You want a warm jacket. Can you simply decide to not want warmth? Not pretend, not force yourself to ignore it. Actually remove the desire of yourself. Could you snap your fingers and suddenly prefer freezing temperatures? Probably not. Now imagine someone you find attractive. Could you simply choose to find a completely different person attractive? Could you decide that you love something you currently hate? Could you decide that you enjoy pain? Our desires feel like the deepest expression of ourselves, but we did not consciously create them. They emerged from our biology, our experiences, our personality, and our environment. And if our actions follow our desires, but our desires are not chosen, then our actions are ultimately based on something outside of our control. This idea was famously expressed by philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. You can act according to your desires, but you cannot choose what desires you have. The basic argument. This brings us to one of the strongest modern arguments against ultimate moral responsibility, developed by philosopher Galen Strawson. Strawson argues that to truly be responsible for what you do, you would need to be responsible for the kind of person you are. Your personality, your values, your desires, your reasoning process, everything that produces your choices. But to be responsible for the kind of person you are, you would have to have somehow created yourself. You would have needed to choose your own nature before you existed, which is impossible. You cannot be responsible for the circumstances that created you because those circumstances existed before you. And if you try to explain yourself by saying, well, I became this way because of my previous choices, the question simply moves backwards. Why did you make those choices? Because of your personality. Where did your personality come from? Previous causes. The chain never reaches a point where we find the person who created themselves. The problem is not merely that we are influenced, the problem is that the thing being influenced was never self-created in the first place. The compatibilist response. At this point, many philosophers object. They argue that this entire argument misunderstands free will. The compatibilist philosopher does not claim that we are uncaused beings floating outside nature. Instead, they define freedom differently. A famous compatibilist argument says, you are free when you act according to your own desires, without external coercion. If I choose to drink a coffee because I enjoy coffee, I'm free. If someone forces coffee down my throat, I am not. The difference is not whether both events have causes, the difference is whether the action reflects my internal motivations. This view has been defended by philosophers such as Daniel Dennett and Harry Frankfurt, and this is a serious philosophical position. It explains why we distinguish between someone choosing something voluntarily and someone being physically forced. However, the determinist objection is that compatibilism changes the question. It explains the type of freedom, but does it explain ultimate responsibility? Because the compatibilist says you are free because you acted according to your desires, but the determinist asks, where did those desires come from? If you do not choose your deepest motivations, your personality, your values, or your temperament, then acting according to them may not be the kind of freedom people originally imagined. It may simply mean that your internal causes, rather than external causes, produce your action. But your internal causes still have causes. The unavoidable conclusion. The problem facing free will is not that human beings are passive. We think, we reason, we deliberate, we consider consequences. Those processes are real. A determinist is not saying that humans are puppets controlled by strings. The argument is subtler. The argument is that the puppet, the strings, and the person pulling them are all part of the same causal system. Our thoughts matter, our reasoning matters, our decisions matter, but they matter as causes, not as uncaused beginnings. The question is whether you are the ultimate origin of those choices, and the more we examine that problem, the harder that idea becomes to defend. Because before you choose anything, you must first be someone who chooses, and you never choose who that someone would be. In the next part, we move from philosophy into the question that makes determinism controversial. If nobody is ultimately responsible for who they become, what happens to morality? Does determinism destroy ethics? Or does it provide the foundation for a more compassionate world? Part 4. Why accepting determinism is actually morally liberating. At this point, many people have the same reaction. If determinism is true, then what happens to morality? If nobody is ultimately responsible for who they become, does that mean that anything goes? Does determinism mean we should simply allow people to do whatever they want because they were destined to? Does a world without free will become a world without consequences? I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings of determinism. The rejection of free will does not require the rejection of morality. In fact, I would argue that determinism allows us to understand morality more clearly. The mistake is assuming that morality requires people to be ultimately responsible for their actions. It does not. We already understand this in everyday life. Why? Imagine a person suffering from a severe mental illness who commits an action while experiencing a complete break from reality. Most people recognize that something morally significant happened. A person was harmed. The action was wrong. But we also recognize that the person may not be fully responsible in the same way as someone who calmly planned and understood their actions. Why? Because we understand causes. We understand that the person's brain was operating under conditions that they did not choose. Determinism simply asks us to apply this reasoning consistently. Perhaps every person is shaped by conditions they did not choose. Morality without free will. A common assumption is that morality requires free will. The argument usually goes, if people are not responsible for their actions, then there is no reason to praise kindness or condemn cruelty. But this confuses two different ideas. The first is morality. The question, are certain actions good or bad? The second is moral responsibility. The question, does a person deserve praise or blame for choosing those actions? A determinist can believe murder is wrong. A determinist can believe that kindness is valuable. A determinist can believe that society should encourage compassion and discourage harm. What they reject is the idea that people are the ultimate authors of their character. A useful analogy comes from religion. A Christian might believe that the universe contains objective morality, but a Christian would not usually believe that an ant is morally responsible in the same way a human being is. The ant exists in a universe containing morality, but it is not a moral agent. A determinist says a similar thing. Morality can exist, values can exist, good and bad can exist, but human beings may not be the ultimate creators of themselves who deserve absolute praise or blame. They may not be sensitive to the moral laws that exist. The problem with blame. The traditional idea of punishment often relies on a concept called retribution. Retribution means punishment because someone deserves to suffer for what they've done. The logic is, you freely chose evil, therefore you deserve punishment. But if free will does not exist, this foundation collapses. A person who commits a crime is not a fundamentally different kind of creature from the rest of us. They are the result of different circumstances, different genetics, childhoods, environments, opportunities, and influences. This does not mean we ignore harmful behavior, it means we understand it. If someone has a dangerous disease, we do not respond with hatred, we ask, what caused this? How can we treat it? How can we prevent it from spreading? A determinist view applies the same approach to human behavior. The question changes from who deserves to suffer to what produced this behavior and how can we prevent it from happening again? Robert Sapolsky and the biological roots of behavior. One of the strongest modern defenders of this view is neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky. Sapolsky argues that human behavior is the product of an enormous chain of biological and environmental influences. When someone commits a crime, he argues we should look beyond the final moment of action. We should examine what happened seconds before, what emotions were active, what hormones were present, what happened hours before, what stress was the person experiencing, what happened years before, how were they raised, what happened during childhood, what happened before birth, what genes did they inherit, what evolutionary pressures shaped their brain. The criminal act may happen in a single moment, but the causes of the act stretch back decades. Sapolsky argues a person does not suddenly become violent at the moment they commit violence. They arrive there. The compassion of determinism. This is where determinism becomes not merely a scientific argument, but a moral one. Imagine two children born into different circumstances. One is born into a stable family. They receive affection, education, and encouragement. They grow up surrounded by opportunities. Another child is born into poverty. They experience neglect, violence, poor education, and constant instability. They develop worse emotional regulation. They struggle academically. They are more likely to turn toward harmful behaviors. Now ask, are these two people equally responsible for the conditions that shape them? Of course not. Yet society often treats outcomes as though they are simply the result of personal choices. The wealthy are often viewed as disciplined and deserving. The poor are often viewed as lazy or irresponsible. The successful person is celebrated as someone who made the right decisions. The struggling person is criticized for making the wrong ones. But determinism forces us to ask, why did one person have the circumstances that encouraged success, while another had the circumstances that encouraged struggle? The myth of pure meritocracy. This does not mean that effort is meaningless. Effort matters. Education matters. Choices matter. But choices themselves emerge from conditions. The belief that every person simply gets what they deserve ignores the enormous role of luck. Luck of birth, luck of genetics, luck of family, luck of environment. One of the most interesting demonstrations of this comes from a famous psychology experiment involving the game Monopoly. Researchers created a deliberately unequal version of the game. One player was given significant advantages. They started with more money, they received more resources, they had greater opportunities to succeed. Predictably, they won. But what was fascinating was how the winners behaved.
How many 500s did you have?
Just one.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I have 3.
And the rich player started to behave a little differently. Rich players eat more pretzels. When moving their piece around the board, they become louder.
I'm gonna buy out this whole board.
And the rich players were significantly ruder.
You don't have enough money to do it.
They were far more likely to showcase and talk about how well they're doing
Life is sweet for me.
and to belittle the plight of those poor players.
Lose all your money soon.
So they became less compassionate.
Yes, and I'm buying it.
And these are patterns that we're observing consistently over hundreds of different individuals.
You're gonna run out of money soon.
As the game progressed, they increasingly explained their success as being due to their own skill. They became less aware of the role of luck and advantage. They felt they had earned their victory. This is not because they were uniquely arrogant, it is a human tendency. When we succeed, we naturally focus on our own effort. We forget the invisible advantages that helped us, social structures and human behavior. This connects deeply with sociology. One of the fundamental debates in sociology is the relationship between individuals and society. Do individuals create society, or does society create individuals? Many traditional approaches emphasize individual agency. This is the idea that people make choices, and those choices collectively create society. However, structuralist approaches argue the opposite. Social structures shape the choices available to individuals. Our class, our culture, our economic system, our education, our family background. These create the conditions in which choices are made. This is one reason determinism has often appealed to socialist and Marxist thinkers. The argument is that individuals exist inside systems. People do not choose the society they were born into, they inherit it. Ideology and the illusion of total choice. Philosopher Louis Althusser described institutions such as schools, media, and religion as ideological state apparatuses. The idea is that societies reproduce themselves not only through force, but through ideas. Schools, for example, often teach the idea of meritocracy. Work hard, get good grades, be successful. Your position in society reflects your effort. There is truth in this. Effort does matter, but the deterministic critique is that this story often ignores the unequal starting points people have. Two students may both be told, work hard and you can succeed, but one has private tutoring, financial security, and educated parents. The other has poverty, stress, responsibilities outside school. They are not starting the same race. The media often reinforces similar ideas. We are constantly shown stories of people rising from nothing. The rags to riches story is incredibly appealing. Films like Slumdog Millionaire show an individual overcoming extraordinary circumstances. And these stories are inspiring, but they can also create a distorted picture. They make rare exceptions feel like normal expectations. They encourage us to ask, if one person escaped poverty, why didn't everyone? But determinism asks a different question. What conditions allowed a person to escape? And how can we create those conditions for everyone? The world determinism wants. A deterministic society would not be one without standards. It would not be one without consequences. It would not be one where harmful actions are ignored. It would simply be a society that understands behavior scientifically. A person who is dangerous still needs to be prevented from harming others, but the goal changes. The goal is no longer revenge, the goal is protection and rehabilitation. A deterministic society would look at crime the way medicine looks at disease. We do not hate diseases, we understand their causes, then we work to remove those causes. We ask, what environments produce violence? What childhood experiences increase crime? What interventions reduce harm? How do we create healthier people? The ultimate question changes. It's no longer how can we make bad people suffer, but how can we create a world that produces fewer people capable of causing harm? Accepting determinism does not make humanity meaningless. It does the opposite. It forces us to take humanity more seriously. Because if people are shaped by causes, then every child neglecting matters. Every person denied an opportunity matters. Every harmful environment matters. Every intervention matters. Understanding causes gives us the power to change them. And this brings us to perhaps the most surprising part of this argument. Many people assume determinism is incompatible with Christianity. They assume Christianity requires a completely free will. But historically, this is not actually true. Some of the most influential Christian thinkers in history defended views remarkably close to determinism. And the Bible itself contains ideas that challenge the modern assumption that humans are the ultimate authors of their actions. That leads us into the final part. Why a Christian should take determinism seriously. Part 5. Why a Christian should take determinism seriously. For many people, determinism sounds fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. After all, Christianity often speaks about choice. Choose good over evil. Choose God over sin. Choose righteousness over temptation. If humans do not possess free will, many people will assume Christianity collapses. But this assumption is historically inaccurate. The idea that human beings possess complete freedom of will has never been the only Christian position. In fact, some of the greatest Christian thinkers in history argue that humanity's will is deeply constrained. They argue that human beings are dependent creatures, not independent authors of reality. And this raises an important theological question. If God created everything, including our minds, our personalities, our circumstances, and the entire universe that shapes us, how independent can our will truly be? Augustine and the problem of human nature. One of the earliest and most influential Christian thinkers to wrestle with this problem was Augustine of Hippo. Augustine argued that human beings are not born as completely neutral agents standing outside of all influence. Because of the fall, human nature is corrupted by sin. Human beings desire wrongly. We are not simply rational beings who calmly choose between good and evil. Our desires themselves have been damaged. This creates a problem that sounds remarkably similar to the determinist argument. The problem is not merely that people sometimes choose badly, the problem is that the very thing doing choosing, the human will, is itself shaped by conditions outside of its control. For Augustine, humanity requires divine grace because people cannot simply rescue themselves through sheer willpower. They need transformation from outside themselves. Luther and the bondage of the will. This idea became even more explicit during the Reformation. Martin Luther wrote an entire book dedicated to this question, The Bondage of the Will. Luther's argument was a direct rejection of the idea that humans possess a completely independent will capable of freely choosing God. He argued that the human will is not neutral, it is bound. It is shaped by sin, desire, and human nature. For Luther, salvation could not ultimately depend on human choice, because that would make humans the decisive cause of their own salvation. Instead, salvation depended on God's grace. Whether or not someone agrees with Luther's theology, the philosophical point is fascinating. One of Christianity's most influential thinkers argued that the human will is not the independent origin of itself. Calvin and predestination. A similar idea appears in the theology of John Calvin. Calvin developed Christianity's strongest doctrines of predestination. The basic idea is that God, being eternal and all-knowing, has a complete plan for creation. Nothing occurs outside of God's knowledge or sovereignty. This creates a famous theological tension. If God already knows and determines the outcomes of history, what does that mean for human freedom? Many Christians have attempted to solve this problem through various forms of compatibilism. They argue that humans can still be responsible even if God knows their actions. Others have embraced stronger forms of divine determinism. The point is not that all Christians agree with determinism. They certainly do not. The point is that the idea of human beings being fully self-created authors of their actions is not a requirement of Christianity. Historically, many Christians have believed almost the opposite. St. Paul and the struggle of the will. Perhaps the most interesting example comes from the writings of Paul. In his letter to the Romans, Paul describes a conflict within himself. He says, "The good that I want to do, I do not do. But the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." This is a deeply human experience. We often imagine ourselves as rational agents who simply choose what we do. But anyone who has tried to break a habit knows this is not how human beings work. We have desires we do not choose, addictions we struggle against, impulses we regret, patterns of behavior that seem to operate beneath conscious control. Paul's explanation is theological. Humanity is fallen and requires redemption. A determinist explanation is different. Humanity is shaped by causes beyond conscious choice. But both recognize something important. The human being is not a perfectly sovereign commander controlling themselves from above. There are forces within us that we did not create. Jesus and the ethics of determinism. Perhaps the most compelling connection is not a philosophical argument from Jesus himself. Jesus did not present a metaphysical theory of determinism, but his ethical approach has a striking similarity to the compassion that determinism encourages. Jesus repeatedly rejects the assumption that people are simply defined by their worst actions. He associates with people considered morally unacceptable by society, tax collectors, sinners, the socially rejected. He does not approach them with the attitude, "You are evil because you freely chose evil." Instead, he approaches them with forgiveness and understanding. One of the most famous examples occurs during the crucifixion. Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Notice the reasoning. He does not say, "Forgive them, even though they fully understand and freely chose evil." He says, "Forgive them because they do not know." Their ignorance limits their culpability. They are acting from causes they do not fully understand. This is remarkably close to the deterministic idea that human beings often act from conditions they do not choose and cannot fully see. Boethius and the problem of divine knowledge. Another fascinating historical discussion comes from the philosopher Boethius in his work The Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius attempted to solve a major theological problem. If God already knows the future, how can humans be free? If God knows tomorrow's decision with absolute certainty, then how can we possibly do anything different? Boethius argued that God exists outside of ordinary time. God does not predict the future, God sees all moments simultaneously, as though from a lofty peak. Therefore, God's knowledge does not force human actions. This has been one of the most influential Christian responses. However, the determinist may still raise a further question. Even if God's knowledge does not force our actions, what about God's creation of the entire system in which those actions occur? If God created our genetics, our personalities, our circumstances, our minds, the laws of nature, the entire chain of events leading to every decision, then it seems philosophically difficult to say that God has no relationship to those outcomes, and as some theologians have argued, it would be strange to suggest that God is sovereign over everything except the one thing that is most central to human existence, the human action itself. The final objection. If nobody is responsible, why have prisons? At this point, some people might say, fine, suppose I accept your argument. Suppose free will doesn't exist. What do you want society to do? Should criminals just walk free? Should nobody be punished? No prisons? This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding of determinism. A deterministic society would not eliminate consequences. It would eliminate revenge. There is a crucial difference. Imagine a dangerous animal. If a tiger escapes and attacks people, we do not hate the tiger. We do not say, what a morally evil tiger, it deserves suffering. But we still protect people. We restrain the tiger because preventing harm matters. Human beings are obviously far more complex than animals. We can reason, we can rehabilitate, we can change. But the principle remains. The purpose of preventing harm does not require hatred, punishment, or rehabilitation. Many modern prison systems, particularly in places like the United States, have historically emphasized punishment. The idea is often explicitly retributive. People deserve to suffer because they chose wrongdoing. This philosophy can produce extremely punitive systems, long sentences, harsh prison conditions, a focus on suffering rather than transformation. A deterministic perspective asks whether this actually improves society. If the goal is reducing future harm, then the focus should be rehabilitation. Why did this person become dangerous? What intervention could have prevented it? How do we stop future victims from existing? A society that believes in determinism would still separate dangerous people from society when necessary, but the purposes would be safety, not revenge. The conclusion: understanding instead of blame. The argument of this entire video is not that humans are meaningless machines. Humans are extraordinary. We think, we love, we create, we reason, we build societies. But we do these things because of the causes that created us. Our intelligence is caused. Our compassion is caused. Our personality is caused. Our decisions are caused. And understanding those causes does not make humanity less valuable. It makes humanity more understandable. A person is not a monster who appeared from nowhere. They are the final result of billions of years of evolution, billions of experiences, countless interactions, and an entire universe of causes stretching behind them. When we understand this, the question changes. Instead of asking, why did this person choose to be this way, we ask, what happened that produced this person, and how can we create different outcomes in the future? Determinism does not ask us to abandon morality, it asks us to abandon hatred. It does not ask us to remove consequences, it asks us to replace revenge with improvement. It does not make people less important, it reveals how profoundly connected every human being is to the world that created them. Perhaps the most compassionate sentence we can say about another person is also the most deterministic. Given everything that happened before, it makes sense that you became who you are. And perhaps the most hopeful sentence is, because causes create people, changing the causes can create different people. The future is not free in the sense that it floats outside reality, but it is changeable, because we are not outside the chain of causes, we are part of it. And understanding that chain may be the closest thing humanity has ever had to true freedom.